I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Dartmouth Centers Forum and our distinguished panelists to our discussion of activism in the electronic age, technology, and social protest. I'm Denise Anthony. I'm director of the Institute for Security, Technology, and Society, and I'm also associate professor and chair of sociology here at Dartmouth. The Dartmouth Centers Forum is a collection of 12 centers, institutes, and key college institutions, of which ISTS is one. And our collective mission is to create a campus-wide environment for constructive thinking and open dialogue about important issues of the day. The Centers Forum facilitates faculty research and enhances curricular activities with seminars, public events, such as this one, and opportunities for student dialogue. Each year or each 2 years, we have a theme, and the theme of the Dartmouth Centers Forum for this year is conflict and resolution. There's always plenty of conflict around and hopefully also some resolution. And so talking about the issue of social protest, which might be seen as both conflict and resolution, is the theme of our talk today. I'd like to thank the staff of ISTS, especially Deb and Nicole and Tom for today, and also to thank the Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, who is a member of the Centers Forum, in particular Chris Wolforth, for their help in organizing the panel today. The idea for this panel and our interest in this panel really came about after observing the Iranian election this summer that I'm sure many of you also followed. As we watched after the election, the people pouring into the streets, and we were reading their tweets on Twitter and their Facebook posts throughout the world that I think fixed our attention on what was happening there and gave us, many of us who may not be experts or who study this part of the world, a little bit of a picture into this regime that we don't often have a very good sense of what's going on. And so let me just some pictures that I'm sure you will all remember. The Flickr, some of the Flickr photos and Twitter photos that were sent around from the Iranian election. Other examples, of course, include the use of text messages to communicate to what are sometimes called protest swarms or text mobs that enable protesters to organize spontaneously and sometimes to stay ahead of the police, for example, in a protest movement. And so some of these were actually people talked about, this is just an article from the Washington Post, about the student protesters in the Philippines, the protests of the World Trade Organization over the past few years, in Seattle, I think it was, and in other parts of the world have made use of these kinds of technologies. So thinking about these examples, we started to wonder, is new information technology and mobile devices changing political protest? Is political protest now possible in a way that it wasn't before because of these technologies? And if so, how is it changing protest? In what kinds of ways? In thinking about these questions, though, we want to be and the role that technology plays, we really want to think about and be careful about making what I think is a common mistake that we make, which is these new technologies are new, and therefore everything about them is new and better. And in doing so, we sometimes then make a historical mistake, which is forgetting the role that technologies have played historically in political protest on both sides of the sides of protest, the protesters themselves, but also on regimes that may have set out to squash protests or prevent protests from happening. So we can think about everything from Thomas Paine's pamphlets to, one of the oldest technologies or the most ridiculed, which is radio. And for example, Radio Free Europe and the role it played in the Solidarity movement, for example, in Poland. And so in asking our questions about the role of new technologies, we want to think about technology in general and the role it plays in political protest. So now, with that very brief introduction, I would like to introduce our three panelists. And what I will do is introduce all three panelists. Each will come up and give a about a 15 or 20-minute talk on their views on these questions about the role of technology in political protest, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments. So I'm very pleased to welcome Bruce ETLING, who is the director of the Internet and Democracy Project at the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society at Harvard University. Bruce's current research is focused on the Russian internet and the study of foreign language internet sites. He has also done research on the Iranian and Arabic blogospheres. Before joining the Berkman Center, Bruce was the director of USAID's Office of Democracy and Governance in Kabul, Afghanistan. So welcome, Bruce. Our second speaker is Professor ELHAM GHEYTANCHI, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Santa Monica College. ELHAM has written extensively on Iranian culture and politics, women's rights, and the politics of the internet in both scholarly journals and in popular media, including on CNN's 360, Foreign Policy Journal, and the Boston Globe. She also has done research on the Iranian women's movement and women's rights in post-revolutionary Iran, and most recently on the 1 Million Signatures campaign. So welcome, ELHAM. And finally, we have EVGENY MOROZOV, who is currently a Yahoo Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. EVGENY is a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine. He also runs the magazine's influential and widely quoted Net Effect blog, which is about the internet's impact on global politics. Prior to his appointment at Georgetown, he was a fellow at George Soros's Open Society Institute, where he remains on the board of the Information Program. And before moving to the US, Morozov was based in Berlin and Prague, where he was the director of new media at Transitions Online, which is a media development non-governmental organization that's active in 29 countries of the former Soviet bloc. So welcome, and now I will turn it over to Bruce.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for having me here today, and it's great to be part of this panel. So our project has looked mostly at the, it's called the Internet and Democracy Project at the Berkman Center, and we started by really just looking at anecdotes related to, because it's so new in some sense, the Internet and the way that we study it, that we didn't even have that. Nobody had done that yet, so we started with that, and one of the first examples we come up against where the Internet and protests come up is with this guy, President Estrada in the Philippines. Back in 2001, became the president. He was, like Ronald Reagan, an actor for a long time, then became a senator and eventually became president. But he got into this corruption scandal and was investigated for corruption. And then his allies basically refuted whatever was said by the court. This led to huge protests. I think over 4 days, there were over 1 million people that met in, I think this was Asada Square, if I'm probably mispronouncing it, but interesting, this was actually the same place in '86 that people also protested against the Marcos regime. So interesting continuity there. But this is what Howard Rheingold called the first sort of SMS-enabled political smart mobs. So this is, again, one of the early examples. Free Burma, the monks' protests in 2007, a little bit, or 2008, a little more recent. Again, this one was interesting because it was much more, it seemed, about getting the word out to the world through the internet, even more so than organizing protests internally with SMS and tools. And so really YouTube and video was an important part of this one. We'll talk a little bit later about state reaction to that one. Here's another example. This is the No Mas FARC, the anti-FARC campaigns in Colombia. This one was organized by Facebook. So as you see, sort of each couple years, it's hard to study because it changes so fast, but it's also useful for activists because it also is useful in different ways. So again, over hundreds of thousands in Colombia, both in Bogota, but also in 100 cities around the world and in other places in Colombia where we're going to. So this is sort of cited as another successful example. And of course, I won't talk too much about Twitter in Iran because I'll leave that to ELHAM. But you know, the sort of Twitter revolution, as it was called in Iran recently, I throw this up as sort of a straw man in one sense because actually, so Andrew Sullivan and a lot of the Western bloggers were really sort of pushing this idea. He really captures at the bottom here kind of the cyber utopian arguments that EVGENY often labels me as being, which is not totally inaccurate. But he says, this is a new information, that this information technology could be improvised for this purpose so fast as a sign of the times. It reveals in Iran what the Obama campaign revealed in the US. You can't stop people any longer. You can't control them any longer. They can bypass your established media. They can broadcast to one another. And they can organize as never before. So I couldn't say it any better than that. However, the sort of reality is difficult to know. One, because we hadn't really, so we spent a lot of time studying the Iranian blogosphere, and I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, all these journalists were calling us and say, what do you know about Twitter in Iran? And we say, well, we don't have any data because we don't know how to study it yet. So actually, the Web Ecology Project, which is sort of loosely affiliated with Harvard and the Berkman Center, did a quick test. Grabbed a bunch of tweets related to the Iran protests, and so this is some of the data we have. It's not doesn't tell us a ton. Although one thing that I will show is that actually it does have a sort of sustained level of interest. And I think what's interesting with the Iranian protests in general, and I'll look forward to see what ELHAM says about it, is that really that it is sustained. It's not a flash in the pan type thing. So the one thing that knocked out all the air out of the Twitter conversation about Iran was actually Michael Jackson's death. So a week after you look at what happens, and you want to talk about flash in the pan, here's a great example, 78 tweets per second about Michael Jackson's death. And even these little second lower bumps here, those are still higher than the highest level that you saw right after the protests related to Twitter in Iran. But again, the data, we don't know a lot. So it seems that it's mostly a discussion. It seems like my sense is, and I'll interested to see what ELHAM says, but really that the Twitter revolution was really the West talking about the protests, and that it's mostly English speakers that are doing it, and it's probably mostly expats. But even we don't have the data, and even if we could go back and get the data because they asked them to, because there was this movement to basically everybody switch to have their Twitter location be Tehran, it's hard to use that data as well. So it'll probably be hard to ever know. So in general, what we've tried to do now, though, is to move a bit away from just anecdotes, obviously use them as grounding, but to really try to develop methods. Really with this space, you need to, I think, reach out beyond typical social science research, but also computer science folks also need to know what those sort of theories are, and so that they can sort of lean and push against each other productively. So what we did is, this was our sort of first big blogosphere study. This is the Persian language internet. It's a social network map of that space. I also threw up the sort of Twitter revolution argument because it really was sort of, it sounded a lot like a replay of what was said about bloggers in Iran just a few years ago. They're young, they're Democrats, they're anti-regime, and it's going to sort of lead to this change. And so what we actually found when we get the data is that it's, yes, that's a small part of it, but it's only this one small corner. And if you don't realize what the rest of the space is like in the other conversations that are happening, you're not really going to know what the actual impact is. So a quick explanation of the map. This is about 6,000 of the most popular blogs based on links, not hits. So we're using links as a hard measure of attention. Each dot is a blog. The bigger the blog, the more links it receives. And it's done with an algorithm that curls up bloggers that have similar links. So it's based on their, the first sort of process is quickly just to show the actual location is just based on your static links, which is your blog role. So it's where does a blogger place himself in this universe of stuff. So if EVGENY and I have a blog with sort of similar links, we'll actually be pretty close to each other if you plotted us on this map, although EVGENY would be a much bigger dot because he's much more popular than I am in terms of the blogosphere. Then we add color to it. Color is based on posts within, the links within posts, so what we call sort of the active dynamic links. This tends to be mostly mainstream media sources, but not exclusively. It can be very popular bloggers will also show up there. And then we sort of dump those into buckets and show how they're similar. And you'll see actually that location and color tends to sort of be closely correlated, but not exclusively. Next, we send in a group of human coders using sort of standard communications research, have humans read and fill out a standard, basically questionnaire, then take all that data. And so we coded about 500 blogs with Persian speakers to actually just tell us things that computers can't, but that humans can very easily. Does it look like a man or a woman that's posting? What are they writing about? What topics do they care about? And generally just telling us qualitatively what's interesting about this group. Just an example we threw up, so we did this a couple years ago, so if we had Musavi's site, it would be much better. So this is showing just where Khatami and Ahmadinejad are located. And what you'll see actually is that, so poetry is a very popular topic. It's actually the most popular topic discussed in the Iranian blogosphere, not politics. But you'll see that politics is discussed. It's almost similar to what the English blogosphere, the American blogosphere, political blogosphere looks like on the bottom here, that you have two groups sort of just truly saying conservative and liberal on each side. Conservative side is closer to Ahmadinejad, and the liberals more close to Khatami. And again, those aren't very probably appropriate terms, but just to give you the idea of what that is. So this is, again, a larger sort of explanation of it. Poetry in the top. Mixed networks is mostly pop culture, things like that. Secular expatriates, a lot of this probably space emerged because reformist newspapers were shut down. The only available space they had was the internet, so even if they were kicked out, they went to this space. And then unfortunately we haven't had time to go back and look at it, but we did do a second map. So this is a map from 2009. The previous one was 2008. This was just before the election, actually. Unfortunately, ELHAM and I were talking. We're going to have to go back and actually do some coding to see what they're actually talking about. But what's interesting, so it's slightly different in the sense that we've added 2,000 more blogs. But if you look, you'll see that actually poetry's gotten bigger, which is interesting, but so has the conservative politics. So if you look at the size of the, a couple of the conservative bloggers here, you see they're getting a lot more links than they were just a little bit ago. And also that the more conservative, or the more religious bloggers on the other side there are also increasing in size, meaning both in shape. So this may be, we can't say definitively, but it may be sort of evidence that this effort to create 10,000 pro-regime blogs actually was a bit successful, or at least with our algorithm. So I've also looked at the Arabic blogosphere. So you probably heard about the April 6th Facebook protests organized in Egypt. We're wondering, you know, again, it's sort of, is this just a one-off event, or is it part of a movement, is something that's sustaining and has legs? When we look at the Arabic blogosphere, so this is mostly Arabic, but also including French and English when that's discussed, when that's used. And you'll see that up in the top right corner there, that actually the largest part of the network is the Egyptian blogosphere. And actually it's the most political and, or one of the most political spaces on the Arabic blogosphere, and it's almost entirely oppositional. So that secular reformist group, that's where the April 6th, people were talking about the April 6th events, that's where the kafaya and sort of enough anti-regime, more sort of democratic movement is based. But you also have, in the green there, the Muslim Brotherhood, so the more traditional opposition is also there. Interesting because the Muslim Brotherhood's activities, political activities, are illegal in Egypt, and yet they're tolerated online, even though you know, those bloggers are every now and then arrested. So EVGENY will talk about this, I'm sure, in much more detail, but I just want to introduce the concept that it's not all roses and sugar plums on the internet. It's not all Democrats and people that think just like us that will bring down authoritarian regimes. This is often explained as a sort of cat and mouse game. I want to sort of introduce this concept of, actually maybe it's more like Newton's third law of the internet, that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And this, I think, captures the essence a little bit more, that it's often, at least in the past, been activists doing something like organize an April 6th event, and then the government reacting by, you know, arresting them and intimidating them. And a year later, there's barely any, when they again try to do the same thing, there's not much impact in that. So that's just a concept. You can tell me why that's stupid or not. So there's a few, I just want to touch again on a couple of the sort of more cruder elements, more cruder ways that states are reacting. One is filtering. So the Open Initiative at the Berkman Center has looked at how governments just around the world are filtering content. What's interesting is, so China and Iran are the two most, quote-unquote, sophisticated regimes in terms of filtering the internet. And yet I think Iran in particular gets a lot of benefit. It's more bluster than actual sort of effectiveness. So if you look at this map, we took ONI's blocked blog data, threw it against our map, And what you see on the right is what's visible in Iran. So if you're sitting in Iran, that's the blogosphere that you can get access to, almost the entire thing. And on the left, you see what's blocked. And it's a little bit less than 10%. So we heard a lot of talk about, oh, but blogs are blocked, and so it's not going to be that effective and whatnot. But actually, it's a fairly small amount. What is also interesting is that it actually is mostly the secular reformists that are getting blocked, so they're being fairly effective in what they're blocking. You probably can't see it here, but there are a couple other bloggers, even a couple poets get blocked because their quote-unquote love poetry is a little too close to pornography. And then in the bottom right corner, so it didn't seem that there were any conservative bloggers blocked, but there was a couple religious bloggers that were blocked for, in particular, promoting temporary marriages, which is sort of against the regime line, I guess. Also, so really the crudest reaction for states is what happened in Burma, simply shut down the entire internet. But Burma might be a sort of rare example because there are only one or two pathways to the wider internet, and they can shut it down pretty easily. We were talking at lunch about this a bit, but it's interesting that even in Burma, they didn't leave it down for very long. And that's probably a bit, so you see at the top there on September 29th, they completely shut it down. But then over the next couple of weeks, it gradually starts to come back up. And so one explanation is possibly that it's the government needs access to it, so they're going to open it at times that they know about and use it. But I think another sort of potential answer is that it's actually the internet's becoming so ingrained in our lives, both in personal and economic means, maybe not political at all, that it's really, the longer they keep it shut down, the more sort of protests they're going to get and the more sort of pushback they're going to get from citizens. So that's actually sort of an argument for expanding access. In general, in terms of internet protests, I actually think that it's worth pushing a little bit further and saying, if you only, so in sort of the democracy and governance work I did before, you don't just focus on elections and you don't focus just on protests because you end up supporting what are really sort of very thin democracies, just electoral democracies, as opposed to robust ones which have, you know, the rule of law and strong protections for speech, lots of developed political parties. And so it's a lot of work, and it's a lot harder than just a quick, here's the internet plus authoritarian regime equals democracy. But we really need to push back against that a bit more. And again, just a final sort of call for, again, pushing for combining different methods, reaching out into fields you maybe don't know about, finding partners to help you understand the space better. This is the English blogosphere, just on the left quickly, and we're next working on Russia. I don't have too much on Russia yet, but hopefully later in the spring we'll have a large report on it. So thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm going to address the three questions that you posed to us. How much of an impact that social media have on post-election protests and green movement as we know it in Iran? Has technology always played a role in political protest, and if so, how? And I'm going to start by answering this question first. Does the new information technology and the internet change the activity and impact of the political protest in fundamental and new ways? Now, I thought of opening up my talk with a list of the protests that have been going on in modern Iran and stressing two facts about them. One is that the protests were mostly done orderly. And this is not a point that I argue. Most scholars on Iran argue the same point, that there's a long history of street protest in Iran, and they were engaged in nonviolent movements. And as you know, in nonviolent movements, there are two characteristics about these movements. First of all, they're very hard to predict. And the second characteristics of them is that they are, social media means a lot to them. So social media means a lot to the social movements in general, but specifically to nonviolent social movements because it can shape their message and reflect, as well as shaping their message. So in 1891 to 92, protests forced Nasreddin Shah to cancel a tobacco monopoly sold to a British company. In 1905 to 1910, street demonstrations, sit-ins, and an outspoken community of Iranians in diaspora helped bring about the constitutional revolution. In 1919, mass protests forever changed the Anglo-Persian relations as their agreement that intended to move Iran into the British sphere of influence was cancelled. In 1941 to 46, street rallies organized by Tudeh Party, the most recognized communist party in Iran, mobilized the workers in opposition to Shah. In 1951 to 53, public protests and demonstrations showed the popularity of Mossadegh, who nationalized oil, and as we all know, CIA-backed coup toppled his government despite popular support. In 1977 to 79, street demonstrations led to revolution, and Khomeini later became the leader. In 2009, as we all witnessed, public outrage at fraudulent election that led to a second-term presidency of Ahmadinejad, backed by Supreme Leader, led to mass movement called the Green Movement. So these, and as I started thinking about my presentation, I was thinking there has always been a fight over the control of social media in Iran. And if we extend that to radio, TV, and other means of social media, there really has been a fight over the control of social media. Poetry used to be a very symbolic way of talking about politics because there has always been lack of social media. During the 1951 to 53 and right after the coup, Shah made it absolutely clear for intellectuals that they cannot dissent, and poetry became one of the ways in which intellectuals voiced their opinions, and in very sophisticated language, having lots of symbols that, you know, even I read poetry on a continuous basis, but I still need help when I read poetry that is deeply political, which talks about dark forces of darkness, and they all represent the forces of dictatorship and so forth. So there has always been this search for finding social media that could be independent of the state, because the state, throughout its existence in the modern history of Iran, has controlled the social media, has controlled the TV. The national television in Iran goes back to 1966, and from its inception it has been controlled by the state and very much used as a propaganda machine, both in pre-revolutionary Iran and very much in the post-revolutionary era. And radio, as we all know, was very important in Iran, and as just as simultaneously as we got the introduction of radio in Iran, we had BBC radio. And BBC is very much both trusted, loved, and hated in Iran because we all know that the coup was the coup against Mossadegh was backed by CIA and the Brits, and there is always this deep suspicion about the role of foreign media. And foreign media is always accounted for, always relied on in the Iranian society, primarily because the state owns the actual national radio. The reform movement in Iran started in newspapers. Right now we have 65 journalists, Iranian journalists in prisons, and they are there because they first started in many of the reform-minded newspapers that started in mid-90s. And the very first one that I remember I used to read, which was mostly about poetry in the beginning, and it talked about how we can find a new interpretation of Islam through the work of Rumi and rereading of Buber and other political scientists. It was a newspaper called, or a magazine I should say, called Kian. And then there were others, Jami'eh, Iqtisad No, Tus, and others. And these journalists, I mean, there's a reason there are journalists obviously it is unjustified, but because of the lack of strong civil society in Iran, newspapers and magazines have filled the role, the vacuum for political parties, and have acted almost as political parties. So that's why you see a lot of journalists who become interested in politics and then later on go into the political field, and vice versa. People who come from the political arena and go into journalism because they want to affect the political processes in that way. But journalism is a contested area in Iran. And I believe the reason is because there has been lack of strong civil society in Iran. Throughout all those protests that I mentioned, newspapers very important from the beginning of the century. There's something called Shabname, and I didn't know how to translate this. These are leaflets that are distributed overnight, and they're still used. These are leaflets that people write their messages on, and they basically spread it all around the city or their neighborhood, and they play a great role in protest, social protest. I happen to think TV is still very important in social movements, especially if you consider Iran being a society where you cannot have access to alternate media, and you cannot really see what is happening in your own streets. And satellite TV, there are 27 to 28 of them now, mostly based in LA by political exiles. And then there is BBC Persian Services and Voice of America. They are very important in what's going on right now in Iran. Excuse me. Now I wanted to begin this next section of my talk, and I hope I don't go over time. I was watching one of these satellite TVs, and there was an Anchorman a couple of weeks ago, and I think he's a famous one. A lot of people listen to him. He was on, and he was saying, fellow Iranians, why is everyone sitting behind their computers? Tweeting, reading Facebook accounts, please get up, go to streets. You cannot have a revolution with a click here and a click there and a click here. A revolution needs foot soldiers. Now, it sounded funny, and it still does, and I'm going to talk about that politics. The new social media, I think, were crucial in what happened in Iran. Now, I've identified these 4 effects, and later on I'm going to talk about also the negative aspects. But the 4 effects of social media on the opposition movement called Green Movement are these. First, it allowed immense sense of empowerment to the ordinary citizens who protested the official results of the election despite the state-controlled media coverage that basically denied the existence of the opposition. 2, it allowed a different image of the Iranian nation to the Iranian outside and inside of the country, and as well as to the world. 3, allowed transnational ties to flourish, not afterwards. Some of you here might be familiar with Kick and Sicking argument, Boomerang Effect. They argue that these transnational ties happen after a repression goes on, and citizens in authoritarian regimes are able to connect with the citizens of other countries and exert pressure. Now, during these protests, these ties happen at the same time as the protest was going on. 4, provided malleable medium in which leadership could emerge horizontally. And this is a radical shift in Iranian politics, since it is essentially opposing elitist leadership, albeit Shah or supreme leadership as it exists in today's Iran. So it questions Khamenei's role and thereby calls for radically different laws and ultimately, I think, constitution. Because if you take out the element of supreme leader from the existing constitution of Iran, it will radically change the content of it. So let me go into them and briefly discuss them. 1, So it allowed immense sense of empowerment. Just as the presidential candidates started their campaign on May 20th, because they only have 3 weeks to campaign, Mousavi went on Facebook. May 23rd, the government bans Facebook. Mousavi supporters immediately start using SMS messages to organize rallies. June 13th, cell phones start filming violence erupting in the streets, identifying the Basij, Sepahi, plainclothed men belonging to security forces as the first instigators of violence. Videos are uploaded on YouTube. Citizen journalism is now an undeniable aspect of the crisis. And the authorities are furious. They smash cell phones, but the numbers only increase. And I did have one thing up and whenever you get time. But I thought that...
Just touch the screen.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry about
This cartoon captures the mood. Thank you. I love this cartoon.
that. It's not up there yet.
It's been censored.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, whereas I attended a talk by one of the a bright scholar who was one of the first women to be beaten during the revolution in 1979, Mahasti Afshar, and she put it very nicely. I'm going to use her phrase. In 1978, a pre-mediated fixed message was created by one charismatic leader on a physical object, cassettes, if you remember, and disseminated secretly in mosque and the bazaar. In 2009, a message evolved in real time through a mix of accidental leaders and masses of ordinary people and disseminated openly in cyberspace. And this was radically different, a different social protest going on. Now, Mahasi Afshar herself recently became active in cyberspace, like 1,000 other Iranian Americans who maybe for the first time in their life felt passionate about a progressive social movement in their homeland. And that's my the next point. Now, as Bruce mentioned, we remember Twitter, the phrase called Twitter revolution. I was following a guy, or I think he was a guy, Persian Kiwi from Tehran, who tweeted the events leading up to demonstration in his city in real time. And his reporting was even better than foreign correspondents, because he was telling us exactly what is happening, and he was telling us the history, the background, the context. I mean, I was getting a full account of it, and many others as well. And I mean, with all due respect to foreign correspondents, he was doing a much better job. And he wrote, "I yearn for a time when there is democracy in my country and I'm no longer forced to sit behind my computer all day long." June 18th, Google announced its translation device for Persian. And as for YouTube, someone wrote that if YouTube were a country, it would be the third most populated in the world. Now, as of today, there are 74,000 posts about Iranian election. And if you Google search term Iran election, June 29th, the term turned 1 million results. November 3rd, 48 million results. And interestingly enough, I don't know why, today it has 38 million results. So maybe they deleted some. And I'm still reading tweets that say, Twitter is all I have, my home, my friends, my country. The second point is it allowed a different image of the Iranian nation. I remember reading a Twitter message, "I'm at my dad's workplace in the Ministry of Guidance. I now have access to YouTube and Facebook." So even though they cut it or they filtered the sites, these kids were able to get on to these sites. And this was like any other person. And we all remember Neda, who murdered before our eyes on June 19, and it was all videotaped. 1 week afterwards, a committee of mourning mothers of Iran formed, and it showed that people in Iran, like what happened in Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, fight dictatorship. So presented a different image. They are seeking for justice. Now, the third point, allow transnational ties to flourish. The Committee for Mourning Mothers of Iran was formed exactly 1 week after the murder of Neda Agha Sultan. On the same day, many announced their solidarity with the mothers. I myself on Voice of America and talked about mourning mothers in Iran. And there were many campaigns that started. Some of you might have seen We Are All Majid. This was a student that they got, and they said that he was trying to escape the university after an anti-regime rally and was dressed in women's dress. And just as soon as they put that news out, there was a transnational movement on the internet calling for the We Are All Majids. There were a lot of Iranian American and other scholars, men who were now with the chador or with a scarf, and came out and they said, "We are all Majid." And so, if you want to belittle him, we render it unimportant because we could be Majid. Now, 4, it provided malleable medium in which leadership could emerge horizontally. Mousavi and Karoubi, the two presidential contenders, have said repeatedly that they are not the leaders of the Green Movement. They have stated in their announcements and interviews that they do not lead. And in fact, if you have Twitters and if you have these grassroots groups that not just through Twitter but through other means, they are in contact with each other, and they are now protesting what seems to be a fraudulent election and much more. They are not going to be easily succumbing to leadership, a centralized leadership. Now, the negative points. Are the Iranian authorities reacting to the internet? Yes. Sepah, the Revolutionary Guard, has set up a cybercrime unit, and this is not what you think. They're not fighting pornography. They're fighting the protesters. So they started filming the protesters and have put up their faces on the mosque. I mean, they printed their faces out of the YouTube clips and so forth that they themselves got, and the ones that are posted on YouTube, and others have posted. They have printed out their pictures, have put in the mosque, have asked people in the communities in different cities to identify these people, and they identify them as thugs. So they ask people, kind of like counter to what we think citizen journalism is about. They have asked people to come forward, identify these people who are disobeying laws and so forth, and they are they should be arrested. Now, a week ago, the head of Information Ministry announced that the government has the power to search people's emails and their SMS messages. We know that the government of Iran has purchased a new technology from Nokia Siemens that allows it to intercept, but we don't know the extent of their interception ability. Neither do we know of their actual resources, because it does require resources. Now, as Bruce said, they do filter on a continuous basis, but we also have a list of anti-filters that go around, and it doesn't really require people to be tech savvy in order to use them, because it's quite simple. You just go to another website, and it allows you, and then they can also use Tor, which allows them to get onto websites hiding their IP addresses and hiding the IP address that they go into. Now, I think it's not as simple as cat and mouse play, as Bruce correctly mentioned. I think that the satellite TV host was also right, that clicking alone is not enough for a democratic movement. So far, we know it has changed the way politics is done in Iran. But I also know that that the internet in and of itself cannot be inherently good, progressive, and so forth. So it's not a value-laden device. It's only a tool. But the way it is used in Iran, I have to say, has changed many things, and is going to change the way people are going to enter the political sphere. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I'm really happy to be here in Dartmouth this week rather than in Washington, D.C., where I usually am. So it's a very good timing. On panels like this, I'm usually invited to play the skeptic or the cynic. And I guess my Russian accent also helps to play that role. So what I will try to do today is to briefly show you my own intellectual evolution on this question, but also try to see if we can come up with any coherent framework for actually thinking about these issues. So as you may have partially understood from my bio, I actually started as a very cyber-utopian and cyber-optimistic character. You know, I used to work for an NGO, which was actually very actively using new media and the internet to, you know, spread change and democratic reform and media reform in the former Soviet Union. And, you know, I got involved with George Soros and Open Society, and, you know, it all seemed very bright that all it takes is just to fund enough blogs and produce enough tweets, and authoritarian regimes will eventually crumble. And it didn't turn so easily. You know, I spent a few years traveling around the region and meeting with activists and coming up and managing a few new media projects. And I started noticing that in some of the countries we were working in, the situation was actually getting worse, not better. You know, they're actually getting more authoritarian, not less. Now, whether it had to do with the internet or not, of course, is a different question. But I didn't really see, I guess, as much change as I had hoped for. So I embarked on this broad intellectual exploration of the relationship between authoritarianism on the one hand and then new media and the internet on the other hand. So I'm finally ready, I guess, to present my findings later this year in a book, but I'll give you a little preview, I guess, of what I found. Now, I think that first of all, it's very hard and almost impossible for us to talk about, you know, unfree societies or authoritarian regimes and how they use the internet simply because there is too much diversity out there. You know, by now, we are kind of ready to accept the fact that, you know, Singapore is an authoritarian country and Libya is an authoritarian country, but they actually have very little in common. Right, but we still stick that label and try to analyze them collectively. You know, I'm very often reminded of this quote from Tolstoy that, you know, all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So I think at this point, I'm close to something like, you know, all free societies are free alike, but all unfree societies are unfree in their own way. And I think the internet actually is also playing a very different role from country to country and society to society. Well, that said, I'd still like to sort of try to identify some generalities which can help us think through some of these issues. Technology and protest. Well, I think that protest is probably, despite the topic of our panel today, is the least interesting part of the relationship between authoritarianism and new media in general. I think that there are many, and I'll come back to protest immediately, but as a digression, there are many more interesting political and social implications that technology and new media and the internet have and play in those societies, ranging from you know, offering entertainment, which was never or often not the case before the internet, or how they're shaping up nationalism. the role they are playing in growing consumerism in those countries, the role they are playing in facilitating international dialogue, but also national and interreligious dialogue. Those are all very interesting questions, which I think in the long term may say more about the ability to survive of those countries than just how the internet impacts protest. So we shouldn't lose sight of these broader trends and impacts on broader social and political processes, which may not necessarily have anything to do with protests. In part because protests are actually quite rare in many of those countries. Some of them are tied to elections, and those are usually the most powerful protests. Those happen once in 5 years, usually, right? Some countries once in 7 years, and sometimes even less. And as we have discovered, authoritarian governments are pretty good at controlling the election situation. You know, in part because the West has been so active in pushing them towards making the elections work or seem transparent or whatever, that many of those governments have actually worked a pretty neat solution in which they get whatever results they want, despite of the protests or the technology or the campaigns which precede the elections. But going beyond that, so yes, I'm ready to grant that the activists and the NGOs and parts of the civil society are now better connected and can reach many more people than they could in the past. This, I think, is something that we shouldn't even be arguing about. This is simply true. The scale of outreach has changed tremendously, and it has helped. Now, has it introduced any risks that were not present in the old model? Probably it did. We still have very poor understanding of how much authoritarian governments and their secret services actually know about the protesters, how much intelligence they can actually produce and draw from social networks, how much evidence they can draw from tweets which supporters of protesters in the West are sharing in the open spaces. All of those are questions which need to be answered before we push as Western governments or Western, media or Western publics these protesters towards Facebook and Twitter as venues of protest. Now, the second question: to what extent is social media responsible for the protests? It may as well be the case that, it is simply epiphenomenal, that people are taking so many pictures because they simply have mobile phones, right? It doesn't necessarily follow that the Twitter activity is anyhow, responsible for getting so many people out on the streets, right? So there may, of course, be a correlation, but the causation is not necessarily proven or even possible to study, right? The problem with some of the studies and graphs that Bruce has shown us is that for blogs and social networks to be truly effective in organizing protests that can really challenge the government, you have to do most of that privately. You can't plan a revolution in the open space and expect that the government wouldn't take countermeasures before you even get out into the streets, right? So the most anti-government and pro-revolutionary activity actually happens in closed spaces, which are extremely hard to study. So the moment they actually get public, they become less useful to activists and whoever else wants to challenge the government. We actually have seen that situation several times in Belarus, where young people did study LiveJournal, did use LiveJournal, which is a popular social networking and blogging platform, to organize protests. After the first 2 or 3 protests, which also were planned and announced in the open on public blogs and communities, authorities and KGB simply started showing up on that square before the protesters. So they were simply arresting people, and by the fifth or sixth attempt, that movement just died out. Right? In part because the state also has many other levers of control. Right? They could threaten those students with being thrown off and out of the universities, or with physical intimidation. There are many other ways which have nothing to do with technology, which the states can use to exercise their power. Now, what does it all, adapt to? Again, I think that there is a very important role that it plays, in getting some of those images outside of the countries, right, and exposing the evil of these authoritarian regimes to the rest of the world. But again, there is nothing new per se in this phenomenon, right? Again, we do know that some of those countries are susceptible to international shaming and naming, and some of them aren't, right? Some of them are responsive to trade sanctions, some of them are not. So again, the fundamental dynamics of politics and international relations haven't really been changed that much. The fact that, and I think Burma actually is an excellent example, we have so many photos from those street protests, and it's very sad that those photos do not add up to anything, right? The government is still very much in power, and if anything, they actually got even more authoritarian over the last few years, right? So again, we should be, I guess, more careful in drawing the conclusions. Yes, there are definitely more tweets, more blog posts, and more photos. Whether they actually influence the old dynamics is something which I think is less certain. Have the governments learned how to control the web? Yes, but I also think that they have learned how to manipulate it to its own advantage. So it's not just, and I've been doing a lot of research on that, it's not just filtering and it's not just censorship. They're actually willing to engage with bloggers. They are willing to learn from bloggers, because one of the primary reasons for collapses of dictatorships over the last several decades has been lack of information, right? They simply do not know what the threats are, and at some point they understand that, well, it's too late to make any decisions, all the people already on the streets. Right now, to an extent, many of those countries are just one giant focus group, where a lot of information is being shared online, all the criticism is disclosed in real time, and for huge regional countries like Russia or China, where there is a shortage of information about what's happening on the periphery, it is actually very helpful for the government to know what's happening. Many of them are encouraging bloggers. The Russian president spoke recently encouraging all governors to start blogging or he'll be firing them. So he actually wants the officials and the citizens all to start talking, because information has a strategic value to the survival of such regimes, right? And again, this is something that we need to recognize. Also, more and more we see governments who are willing to reach out to bloggers and even take their criticism and say that, yes, we take your point and we would like to change something. Whether they do it for propaganda purposes or it's just some genuine attempt at democratization, well, I think it's the former. So we do see the Chinese government eager to let bloggers deliberate on questions like property rights or corruption or even environmental problems. But the moment that those discussions spill into human rights or religious issues or the issues about Tibet or Falun Gong, those discussions are immediately cut. So the government does see some value in encouraging some discussions. On many other discussions, they are just very aggressive, very harsh, and are eager to step in and censor and beat people up. Again, you also, I think, have to realize that the internet offers a very good way for, propaganda. We see that very often. I use this example a lot on, for example, in gaming. So we do see a lot of games coming out of China, but also of Russia, which do try to promote certain political messages which are favorable to the government. So we see the Chinese government recently releasing a game where you're playing a character who's supposed to do good deeds and eventually win a copy of Chairman Mao's collected writings, right? And this is not just one example. There are many others, where you are supposed to go and attack all the Japanese because of, for historical reasons. So it's strategy games and war games, right? So again, many of those are, again, I can show you an example of an interesting game called Stalin versus Martians, where the narrative is that Martians landed in Siberia in 1943, so Stalin is fighting not just the Germans, but also the Martians, and he, of course, wins, right? Those are the kind of very strategic, movements which we tend to miss if we just focus on issues like censorship or filtering. So the internet now is just a much more complex phenomenon which is playing in those societies on so many levels that by focusing only on protest or by focusing only on what happens with censorship, we tend to miss many of those phenomena. So I think I'll stop here and we'll have time for questions. Yeah, thank you.
I was interested in what your thoughts are on the Orange Revolution and what role technology played in that, because you work for Sorensen.
Yeah, I think it's a very sad question given where the Orange Revolution ended up this week. But again, I think it's very hard to determine the exact role that, for example, text messaging played in that campaign. The standard narrative, which has been partly supported by the Berkman Center, is that text messaging was crucial in getting people out into the streets and keeping them there, right, for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Again, I think there is some truth in that, but I think it's also unrealistic to expect that hundreds of thousands of people who showed up on that square were not aware that they had elections a few weeks ago, were not aware that those elections may have been stolen, and to trigger their political commitment and sense of citizenship, all they had to get was a text message telling them, well, you should show up here and there, right? So I think it's of course very, we want that narrative, right? We want that narrative saying that, hey, we have this new technology, and by using it, we can actually suddenly convert those people from creatures who are mostly apolitical and who are not necessarily involved in politics into these political enemies and news junkies who listen to Voice of America every night and who are, all dissidents. It's just the lack of technology which prevents them from going into the streets. I think it's a very naive narrative. I think there are many other layers here which need to be unpacked, and technology is instrumental in the sense that, yes, you can better inform people where to go and what to do, but I think there are many other political and social forces which probably explain the Orange Revolution and its failure eventually, better than technology does. I don't know if it answers, but so I don't think it was significant.
I think it's somewhat similar. It's not about the specific case, but I actually hear Bruce and EVGENY agreeing a little bit, believe it or not. And Bruce, you're talking about that protests, focusing on protests, are really just thin democracies, and I think that's the same point. This is political activity, but it is really at the surface, and ELHAM made the same point too. Obviously, the social networks, the ties, the organizations have to be there for the technology to tap into. But I wanted to hear maybe all of you, but starting with Bruce, a comment on, so if those are thin democracies, and I like that term, what do you think, how what are the deeper, the richer democracies? Are they policies? Are they social networks? Are they resources? How does technology play in? What thickens those potential democracy or nascent democratic movements?
I think so actually I do agree with most of what Evgeny said. So you're correct on that.
You're getting old.
Or I've listened to you too much. It's one or the other. But I actually think part of the reason why we hear so much about the internet and protests is because the internet actually is really good for organizing protest activities. It makes it easier. It's lower cost. Anybody can do it, and so it's also really good at election campaigns. So we had a bunch of the Obama and McCain people come and talk to us after their event, after the election, and I don't think anybody in that room disagreed that Obama was he didn't get elected because of the internet, but his campaign used it really effectively. And so the internet's really good for things like that, where you have a movement that's got an end date, and it's a specific thing that we need to do, and here's the steps that we need to do to get there, and we can tap into our friends and social networks through it. Unfortunately, I think, and I'll use the Obama sort of example, once you get into government and you need to start improving transparency and you need to try to get people involved in day-to-day governing and making decisions and what do you think about healthcare and how should we change it, the internet isn't as good as that because you have huge bureaucracies and very few of them are open to the types of social media. I mean, they're trying, but it hasn't been terribly effective. So the first, I think, YouTube or online chat that Obama had, it was basically full of people promoting legalization of marijuana. I don't think that's the type of detailed policy debates they were looking for. So I think actually that we'll continue to hear lots of examples of how the internet's used for protests. The types of things specifically that it can do, I think things that like the Sunlight Foundation are doing, tracking money, actually crowdsourcing how the movement of lobbyists in and out of the halls of Congress. Those sorts of things are how it can be used. We're not quite as good at it yet, but I'm hopeful.
I think, yes, I also like the thin democracy concept, but I think just as we have different cultures, we also have different cyber cultures. I mean, there are some things that we have that are common in the cyberspace, but there are some cases that you have to look into the one country, specifically, and what role the social media and new technology plays in that one specific country, in that one specific region, with the context and the background and the political history behind it. The case of Burma, I think, is an interesting case because, the international relations with regard to Burma are, you can't rely on international relations. There is no oil in Burma. There is no, doesn't have that much of a political significance for the policymakers in the United States. So, yes, there got to be a collection of forces and elements that would make technology crucial in one country, but you also have to pay close attention to the specific cultural fabric of the societies you're talking about. Because I think in a country where journalism is being treated as a crime, like Iran, then being on the internet is quite an active political act. And I didn't talk about this in this talk, but the women's rights movement have used the internet quite effectively in terms of being able to connect with many women's groups in the region as well as outside of the Middle East, and they've used it quite effectively to echo their messages, find solidarity, campaign for their demands and for their needs, and also campaign around the freeing of all the political prisoners and those who are in the prison solely because they have participated in women's rights movement. So there are cases in which you have to take other elements and also the political culture of that country into consideration.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit uneasy. I feel a bit uneasy when we tend to bring up cases like ELHAM just did, where civil society has succeeded online, right? Because for every case like this, you look at Saudi Arabia. For every group that wants to promote women's rights, you can actually go now on Facebook and check the page of the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and Elimination of Vice, which is actually all they do is trying to repress women's rights, right? And actually make sure that people don't share photos, of them with men or whatever, right? So I think even for complex societies, there are all sorts of forces there which may not necessarily be affiliated with the government, which would still not be very conducive to the democratic agenda, and we have to be realistic that those forces are empowered in equal measure. But beyond that, what I wanted to say is that, and I say it only based on my conversations in Washington now, is that the internet is looked upon as some, magic bullet, as kind of a hammer, where, and then everything looks like a nail to that hammer, so we can address democracy, civil society, monitor elections, introduce transparency. It's just that none of those things work without the internet, usually when we try to do them. And what makes us think that the internet will make it any easier? Yes, we can try to put as much data as we want about corruption in Kazakhstan online, but this is not going to change much. You can go and look at the villas of their government officials, and that's a testament to corruption right there, right? You don't need to dig any deeper. The problem is that we do not have a good grasp of how data is connected to transparency and how transparency is connected to accountability. And we know even less about the role that the internet plays in this process. So yes, we can be talking about thin democracies and trying to introduce these elements of civil society. I just think it's going to be very hard because we don't know how to do it without the internet. And the internet is not going to make it any easier. Chances are it will only make it harder. Look at a country like Russia now, I would argue that, or Belarus, I would argue that the reason why the government is in power and we don't see protests is because they're popular. And it's genuine support. And people, for some reason, are actually happy with the balance between economic development and political rights that they have. And if you start analyzing those countries, or Singapore for that matter, if you start analyzing those countries from this perspective, you see very little protests, and it's very hard even to think about how you can push people to new types of thinking. And the sort of thin versus thick democracies, you may also bring this dichotomy between deep and strategic learning. You may as well argue that, yes, people know that the government provides them with good life, but they're not willing to go beyond that and start engaging in deeper critical thought that is required for them to overthrow the government, because the other options just look too risky. But again, this brings us back to bigger political debates which have nothing to do with technology. So I started my own research thinking that technology is the answer, and now I'm sort of running away from that thesis as much as I can, because it's not the answer and it's not the question.
For ELHAM, the student rebellion in Iran in 1999 was put down relatively quickly because presumably, and I think you would agree that it was pretty much limited to Tehran and to the university students there. 10 years later, there's the huge fixed election, and more than just the students come out. To what extent do you think the new technology has penetrated not just North Tehran, the more advantaged, more Western-oriented, but the South Tehrans and the provinces in that 10-year period?
Yes. I just want to misspell one myth about North and South in Tehran. It was true that North was home to middle class and upper class, and South was more to the poor. But I visited Iran 2 years ago, and this is not the case. You go to the northern Tehran, and you see a very mixed population. You go to South Tehran, you see teachers living in complexes. And I don't think any of us would say we are the poor in any country. But, anyway, but there is, I do have a sort of a, there are more than 3 million who have mobiles in Iran, and more than 25 million who have access to the internet.
Roughly a third of the population.
Yes, but you know, like I was at one point I was doing analysis of book reading in Iran. This was for another project, and I couldn't find out why a book is so popular if there has only been 20,000 of them sold. You know, how could the book be talked about on all the blogs and so forth, and yet the publisher says we only sold 20,000. There's a thing in Iran, and if you go to bookstores or the places where they sell books, they have a sign that says, "We lend books." I mean, the guy makes his money off of selling the books, but he also lends the book. And it makes no economic sense, but they do that, you know? And just as they lend books, there is also a practice of sharing technology, which will not figure into the statistics if you want to go by statistics. And there's also, you know, computers at universities and places in Shiraz and faraway places like Ahvaz and Abadan and the south of Iran, where people go use the internet periodically, or the coffee nets that emerged in many places in Iran. The people go and use and get out, or they share mobiles, and that's pretty. That's a common practice. So in that way, there is more access, there's more penetration than we could simply find out through statistics. And I guess your question was about the 10 years ago. It was mainly in the Tehran University. Yes, and also, and I think here is a case about social media. It was crushed at inception. I mean, we didn't have a lot of images. We didn't get a lot of reports. We didn't have reporters who go in there. I mean, we did have one, you know, if you remember the picture of the guy, the economist. And the guy is living in the United States now and so forth. But there wasn't much of reflection in the social media about it. And Khatami, I mean, this is why we need to take all the elements into account. And Khatami at that point was not willing to listen to the demands of the students. He simply was not convinced that the time for radical reform is there. And that, and you know, Montazeri, who passed away a couple of weeks ago, there's a very interesting letter that Ayatollah Montazeri wrote to Khatami a couple of years ago, saying that, you know, your biggest mistake was to succumb to the more conservative forces, and you didn't listen to people, you didn't listen to the student uprising, and so he wasn't willing to listen. And the reform movement in general was not willing to go forward and make the reforms that they were elected for. And so there are many reasons, and you know, these are some. Yes, and I think Misa had a question too.
I was just wondering, I have read some of your works on the women's movement and 1 million signature of that. To organize this protest, you need several elements of organizing that Denise mentioned, mobilizing interests, opportunities, all kinds of things that have to come together to get these people moving. What aspects of it that the women in Iran are using? Are they promoting through the social media the consciousness, or are they organizing, enhancing the solidarity to mobilize for action, or are they affecting the opportunities that women have, providing tactics and strategy? Well, I'm not clear what aspect of the technology, social media, is it that's affecting all these protests?
Right. The women's movement, which I study mainly because I'm so impressed by them, is that they have done something that the political activists in Iran don't usually do. I mean, these are leftist or reformist or people who, or even the Islamists, and that is to listen to people. And so the 1 million signature campaign started with this mission of listening to people, to asking them what you need, what you think should be changed, and reflecting that in their demands for change. And they lobbied the political figures at the same time that they worked with the grassroots movement and tried to provide a list of demands that are basic. They are separate from political trends. These are the demands that the Iranian women have had for the past 100 years, starting with the constitutional revolution. And in my opinion, they were also successful because they framed it as a huquq senfi. So they identified themselves as a senf, as a guild, as an interest group, and these are the things that they want, just like workers' guild, just like teachers' guild, and so forth. And they've said, you know, we are a guild that is continuously and historically been denied our rights that should be there for us, constitutionally speaking. And so they have targeted the state, but not just the state. You know, see, the social movements in Iran usually target the state and then stay there to see what happens. You know, they demand something from the state and then they wait. And but the Iranian movement, women's movement, has been quite vibrant. They have engaged in consciousness-raising groups, NGOs. Even though the NGOs get closed down, others rise up. And so they have been quite robust. And they have used the technology, I think, quite effectively in terms of websites. The website for 1 million signature campaign have been filtered 23 times so far. But every time they just change the title by putting a space, spelling it a different way, and getting the word around. And so they have used that, and they also have used it in order to talk to their counterparts in the region as well as the world.
Well, my question was, you described it as much of a horizontal movement at this point in time. I think that that's driven across the board. And in regards to the next step of organization, obviously, where do you see the actual messages to formalize something and keep it more sustained along the lines? I think that that's really the question right now is how do you sustain interest, because inherently social networking is inherently social, so there are interests that are represented for a certain period of time, but then that obviously fade off as time goes by.
Yes, that's a great question. I will not pretend that I have the answer. You know, many people are writing about the fact that does this movement have a leader or does it not? If it doesn't have the leader, would it get anywhere? You know, I think the fact that it is horizontal. The first time, I mean, I didn't think that Mousavi was a great candidate to begin with, because I was a student when he was a prime minister in Iran. And the guy was not charismatic. I mean, nobody ever listened to him. He didn't have anything to say. He was dull. He was, you know, but social networking site made him interesting. You know, he came there were pictures of him on social networking sites holding his wife's hand. And then he gradually appealed. But the reform movement, you're right, it's horrible, but the reform movement has proved to be lagging behind the people and the people's demand. So in that way, I mean, the extent to which they are effective is limited, and I don't think anybody has the illusion that this guy was going to change anything. That's why I'd like to call him accidental leader. And the horizontal membership that happened, I mean, I started becoming interested in this when I saw these student groups popping up everywhere in Tehran. They were Puyesh 88, Puyesh 88. They had many other names, and every center had its own name, you know. And they had nothing to do with Mousavi. They just wanted to have a different candidate, and they just wanted to, and he was quite open, you know, through social networking sites and through other, I mean, he did come on TV, he did, and then they were a lot of demands that were put up to him, you know, what are you going to do about women's movement? There is a Hamgarayi Zanan, there a whole coalition of women who came out and said, you know, what are you going to give to women? What are you going to do to women? And then workers and so forth. So he opened up, and and so I think that horizontal membership affected the leadership, and is going to this dynamic is going to continue. Now, is it going to be most effective? Will they be defeated like the cases that he mentioned? I don't know. I mean, might be, but I don't know. I don't know if it would be because of that or many other factors that are also involved and quite crucial in the case of Iran.
There's a wonderful, powerful documentary right now in the festival circuit called Burma VJ. I don't know if you see it, but one of the things that it does is it documents these video journalists that were in Burma on the streets, really risking their lives to document the protests of the month. And what I'm wondering if there's something that you mentioned about how when protests stay in the dark and don't come out to the public and are so well documented in a way, how they're more effective. And if you think Burma, what happened there in some ways would have been better off had it not had all these video journalists out there documenting everything, showing where the monks were, revealing this to the world, and in some senses making this more, the actual government more aware of what was going on, so it was less threatening. Is that what you would say? Or I'm just really curious about how you think these sort of images affect outcomes of these protests.
Sure. Well, you know, I certainly think it was very effective in terms of raising this issue in the West. That's certainly the case. Whether it played a role in mobilizing the Burmese to go out, I don't know. The penetration rate in Burma is something like 2%, right? So very few people actually online, and I'm sure that people who online in Burma are mostly related with technology, or they already have some pro-Western bias, so, or, you know, anti-junta bias, so they probably know that something is happening. So I don't think it played a huge role in mobilizing the new protests. Did it reveal to the government where the protests were happening? I also doubt, because the human intelligence network that they have built is just much more powerful than anything you can do online, in part because there is very little stuff happening online when you just have 2% of the population there, right? So I think it was mostly very useful in the Burmese case. Again, there are limits to what can be done, which have nothing to do with technology. I'd also like to push back, I guess, against what Bruce said by showing us examples of, you know, Egypt and Colombia. Yes, those protests take place. Do we know why we don't? You know, the protest movement in Egypt, you know, April 6, 2008 worked very well. May 4th, 2008, where they tried to do the same thing on Mubarak's birthday, didn't work out. April 6, 2009, didn't work out. You know, the Colombian protests, yes, they worked February 2008, tried to do the same thing by exactly the same people using exactly the same methods against Chavez in Venezuela in September 2009, didn't work out, right? So a lot of this happens for reasons which are beyond us, and when reasons are beyond us, it's very hard to plan ahead. So yes, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Is it because of technology? Is it because in Egypt there was a general strike organized, you know, by the workers at a textile factory? There was a lot of big role played by the unions, with social networking just, you know, getting some traction, but the actual leaders of the movement being real people embedded in that local context of the factory, I don't know. You know, you actually look at that case in Egypt, brings yet another interesting point. The protests were actually driven mostly by anti-privatization and anti-liberalization rhetoric of Mubarak, who wanted to privatize that factory. So if you really want to look at it very deep, it was actually anti-Western protests because they didn't want to do what IMF wanted them to do, right? So, but we tend to not to notice those things and think that those are the people who are bringing a democratic pro-Western revolution to Egypt, right? And again, often this happens because we only get to hear from the good guys. You know, all the foreign journalists based in Cairo talk to 5 bloggers who all speak English and want to talk to foreign journalists. You know, the people who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood don't want to talk to foreign journalists and they don't speak English, so you never know that they actually exist. If you speak Arabic and spend time in Egypt, you actually recognize they're much more powerful and much more popular than the Western bloggers. Do we see it in our media? We don't. for various reasons, right? So again, there are a lot of biases which I think need to be corrected, and we have to be aware of how many of those narratives are constructed in our own media before we can actually think through what's actually happening.
Can I add something to what you were saying, just as evidence? We know that the Iranian authorities are quite active in cyberspace in Latin America, promoting Shia Islam. So that's another another example of how a regime could be quite active in another cyberspace quite effectively. So you're right.
Sure.
So it seems like a lot of the research you guys presented has to do with the open parts of it. You know, Facebook and certain regimes can go in and sort of squash these things. It seems like where skepticism sort of stems from too. But there's a whole other part of the internet that we really don't know about. There's like the closed side of it, right? There's all these private websites that people go to, or you won't know about unless you're part of those groups. And I wonder, are there any good examples of activists using, you know, the internet or technology in that way versus instead of this whole social media openness?
Who wants to? I have actually an Iranian example, but.
Well, I'll give the obvious one is if you look at the Arabic blogosphere, we were somewhat surprised that there was almost there was no formal cluster around extremism or terrorism or sort of jihadism, and that's because most of it lives on private chat rooms, and that there's so many people watching for it that they've actually been pushed underground. So we can only study the space that's open, or at least we can't get past any sort of board that would approve human research if we're going, you know. So we can only really look at the space that's open, and that's sort of also why we're making these arguments about a networked public sphere, that you can have these discussions and debates and movements off the space, but really it should be, at least in a sort of more formal, democratic, sort of robust democracy, that sort of debate should be out in the open, and more voices should be allowed into it. So there, someone we know as part of the Open Initiative did do some research into the terrorist, for lack of a better term, sort of forums. And, you know, the one thing to say is that they're pretty small. They're there. They're moving a lot. But maybe Yevgeny has some other examples as well.
Well, sure. Again, it depends on what we are looking for. I mean, are there terrorists and extremists using the web in ways which we do not know yet? Sure. Do they also use them in open platforms? Sure. You know, as we've seen with this Nigerian guy, he posted so much stuff online that's actually ridiculous that NSA didn't do anything, or, you know, CIA didn't do anything. Are there activists who use those technologies to push for democratic change? Of course they do, but again, you know, much of it would be limited to sharing, you know, books or videos, or, I mean, you still need people out there in the streets, right? So if they don't have any effect, sort of in real politics, I just, you know, I don't see the point. I mean, there is, of course, a point that, you know, you distribute literature and people become politically aware, and there is an element of that, and there are a lot of interesting political anti-government resources which are being circulated on BitTorrent sites, for example, right? So it is definitely happening. One example which I found very interesting was last winter, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times about actually Iranian activists using a website called Goodreads, which is kind of a social networking site for book lovers, to actually talk about politics. So they carved out a little space on this website, which they thought Iranian authorities would never look at, because why would they, right? It's just a very innocuously looking site. And they carried on in, you know, a Persian talking about their own issues, thinking that nobody is watching. And of course, the moment Los Angeles Times publishes an article about them, they stop being useful, right? So there is always this tension where, you know, we kind of know, and I'm talking as someone, you know, who does a lot of media work, we know about those groups, but you don't want to publicize them because it would then threaten the groups using them. And that's the same pressure that applies to researchers. You know, so when Berkman does a study on, you know, circumvention and anti-censorship tools, they don't release those results immediately, but wait for 3 years, because if they do, the governments will be the first readers of that study, and they'll, you know, implement all the bullet points before the activists even get a chance to read it.
In the case of Iran, they were actually reading Berkman Centers report and using them in the courts.
Yeah.
You know? But there are encrypted messages there's activism in second world, and that is not always quite open. There are also good old email that could be encrypted and so forth, and the example he said.
I think we should thank our